what is the role of religion in our ever-changing world? From the News Channel 5 network, this is Issues of Faith.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Issues of Faith. When you picture God, what picture do you see? We're going to delve into that today with the author of a new book, God Is. It is written by Mallory Wychoff, and Mallory Wychoff is here. Thank you for being here.
Delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
I like the book, and I like the what you're getting at in this book, and so that question I ask: when you picture God, what do you see? So many people see a father figure, a masculine God, but what are you saying in this book?
Well, even I think posing that question is really essential to say, what do I image when I think about God, when I think about the divine? Plenty of people have some measure of engagement with faith, with spirituality, with God, but aren't often taking that second to say, what do I actually imagine, though, God to be like? You know, when I sit down to pray or meditate or think, what's the image on the other side of that that's showing up for me? And whether I think about that or question it or not, it's still operating, it's still functioning, and it's still informing and impacting that experience. And so that, for me, is really the crux of this book, to say that the ways that we think about God, what we imagine God to be like, to look like, necessarily informs the ways that we think about everything and everyone else. How we think about ourselves, how we think about our neighbors, who we see or don't see, the value that we ascribe to others or don't, right? The assumptions we have about their power and agency or not. All of these questions come into play, all these issues come into play when we think about the image of God and the way that it's functioning in our lives.
So many people would answer that, you know, God the Father. God is a father figure, a male. And for many people that's meaningful. You say for some that's problematic. And it's certainly limiting. Is that right? And so what if you know, the picture is just God the Father, a male? What about that picture?
Yeah, so that's exactly it. I think in some cases it can be really problematic for some. For others, it can be really helpful and meaningful. And in either case, it's still really limited. It was never meant to be the only option that we had, the only image or metaphor that we had to engage the divine, that is reflected in that image, but also exists beyond it, right? There's such abundance and diversity within the divine. So why would we ever want to limit our experience of or expressions of God to this one image that, helpful or not to someone, it is still limited, it's still singular, and it's only reflective of a certain group of people and not everyone. So in some ways, I can relate to that God, and in others, I can't. Right? So I'm thankful for that image. I'm thankful for that metaphor. I talk about the ways that it was, you know, helpful for me. I'm really fortunate to have a lovely and wonderful father. So that's not a painful, for me, image or metaphor. And yet, I am not father, right? I am not male. I am not masculine in that way. And so I desperately need more God images, more God language that are more reflective of my own lived and embodied experience. And I want that as well for my neighbors who are equally not represented by that one singular image.
So how do we broaden it? If that is limiting, what would not be limiting?
Well, that's part of why I wanted to write this book, was to, one, just kind of critique that notion of this one singular image and the way that it's operating and functioning and keeping us pretty small and putting some really unnecessary constraints on humanity. That's certainly been my experience. But then to also offer this array and this collection of, in this book, distinctly feminine images and metaphors for the divine, so that all people, regardless of their gender identity, would be able to see themselves reflected in God. And I can say in my own experience that absolutely shapes the way I think about myself, that when I'm approaching God, when I'm seeking to be thoughtful or prayerful or meditative, that I'm not having to think of myself in some other way. It's not this mediated experience that I have to become something other than who I am in order to connect with or engage with God. Because when God shows up as mother for me, I know what it's like to be a mother. That's part of my lived embodied experience. And there's a much more tangible and real and rich quality for that for me than for other metaphors that might only be masculine and different from my experience. So part of what I'm wanting to invite people into is to begin to explore and engage with some of these other metaphors for men and women equally, to engage with some of these and to see the ways that it opens up our eyes and experience to a much fuller picture and understanding of God and of ourselves.
And so are you saying God can look different at different times? There are times you need a mother figure, there are times you may need a father figure, or not? Is that kind of what you're saying? Or it sounds like God would look different at different times, or for you, it's always going to be more of a motherly figure?
Yeah, so the first chapter of the book, I name some of the parts of my life, right, and some of the iterations, some of the Mallorys that have gone before. And I take time to reflect on these different parts of my lived experience, and then thinking about what image of God was really powerful and helpful for me, really operative in those different seasons, because all of those iterations had significant moves and changes and ebbs and flows. And if I only had a static image of God and only one option, you know, for which to engage, that would have not been helpful. But instead, at 5 and 6 years old, to have this image of God as Father, that was really beautiful and meaningful. I felt safe with that God. I felt seen. As I talk about, you know, I can crawl in that God's lap, and that God's going to read me the books and do all the voices like my dad, right? That's a safe image for me. It's not for many people, but it happens to be so for me. But as I continue on, as I kept going, as I kept expanding and evolving, so too did my images of God need to expand and evolve, so that, for instance, years later, in a season where thinking about God in this anthropomorphic sense, right, where I'm assigning these sort of human attributes to, was not helpful, because I did not know what I believed about God anymore, and if I was even certain what that word meant. So instead, in that season, to think about the divine as this sense of deconstructed presence, that even when everything I thought I knew was sort of breaking away, there was still this very clear sense of presence, right? And engaging that image, that understanding, that sense, that language was deeply helpful for me. And so in each of the movements of my life, really thinking about and sensing into what image of God is showing up for me in this way. And certainly when I became a mother, the image of God as mother took on even more weight for me, as it continues to do so.
You talked about finding yourself hiding under a table, and how that changed your trajectory of I guess, of faith for you. What about that? Talk about that story, how you were hiding under a table and it changed your trajectory.
Yeah, so I had spent several decades building this shame management system to basically survive and function after some early childhood trauma, right? A way to make sense of myself and how I would move in this world, as we all do. We begin to tell ourselves stories about who we are and what we're able to do and to be here in order to function and survive. Those are really helpful for me. They helped me perform. They helped me to succeed, to achieve, to feel this sense of esteem and accomplishment. At the same time, even as I was seeking to perform, to achieve, and have that sense of visibility, I also very much had the sense of hiddenness, that these parts of myself could be exposed to others because they were the good parts. But I knew what was really true about me. I knew that actually I was that dirty little 5-year-old girl. That was the story that was most true. So I had to keep that part of myself hidden and constantly balance these two realities. And it was just this tightrope walk at all times to making sure that I was visible enough to be seen and people could see, oh, she's not so bad, there's something of value here. So that hopefully, though, the hidden parts would stay hidden and people wouldn't know the true story about me. That worked really well for me for about 3 decades, until I had my first daughter. And when Olive was born, all of a sudden, the scales I so expertly balanced for 30 years just were tipped. And all of a sudden, I was just hidden. I didn't have my normal coping mechanisms of holding a microphone, being on a stage, getting accolades and success, right? I was just hidden at home, often very tired, spending endless hours nursing a newborn who was crying a lot. I was crying a lot. She was getting bathed, sometimes I was as well. You know, it was just a wild experience. And so finding myself feeling very hidden and going, all of a sudden this shame management system I had developed is no longer working the way that it did. And so I mentioned that in that I spent some time entering into a particular text in the New Testament, in a story in Luke 7, and seeking to imagine myself in that story. So I'm not looking for what's the right way to think about this story. I'm actually seeking to enter into it fully and see what there is here for me to see. So having this time to enter into imaginatively into that scene and see, okay, where do I find myself here? With what character do I identify? And I was looking at different ones and going, no, it's not the woman here, it's not the leaders here, and I could not find myself in the story. And I just sat there to sense into it more fully, and eventually I saw, oh, I know where I am in the story. I'm over in the corner in a table by myself, hidden under the table. And that was so representative of how I felt in that season, right? And so I'm observing the story, kind of hidden and alone. And then I have this encounter of Jesus coming over to the table and sitting under the table with me. We didn't say anything, there were no words, there was no pressure to move out, to fix anything, but rather to be full presence with me in that space. And that singular moment did not heal me, but it was certainly part of this larger healing to say, the stories, the ways of being that helped me survive and get me to this point, that helped me, are now working against me, and I'm being invited into a new way.
Fascinating. So it's a story that's in the Bible, but you weren't connecting with it completely. And that's kind of what you're saying. We need to find our own way to connect, and it's bigger than maybe what you're just reading. Is that kind of what you're saying there? I mean, that's very interesting, the way you just put that.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, when they approach sacred text, and certainly in traditions I was formed in, it was, let's figure out the right way to think about this so that we can make sure we've got it all straight and we believe all the right things. And I'm not saying that orthodoxy is necessarily unhelpful or problematic. I'm just saying it's a way to engage these sacred texts, and so it's very different if instead I'm seeking to go in, not saying I'm looking for the one right way to know how to believe about this, but instead, this is a story and a scene here, and I'm being invited to enter into it, to understand the truth that it's conveying, this sense of God that it's pointing me to, and what it's inviting me to see about my own self in the midst of it.
So, all right, I want to ask you if you're getting pushback. Do you get pushback sometimes when you talk about this? I mean, the Bible, it says, God the Father, that kind of thing, and that's the way so many people look at God. But this broader picture, some people, do they push back? That'll be my question. So we'll take a break. Be back right after this.